This summer, many of you in this room are going to go to a beach somewhere. When you get there, I want to challenge you. I want you to walk out to the shoreline as the waves are crashing, as you look out and see water as far as the eye can see before it crests over the horizon. And as you're standing there, I want you to speak to the waves and tell them to stop and see what happens. We are entering the time of year when afternoon thunderstorms are quite severe. The next one we have, I want to challenge you to stand on your front porch. When the wind is blowing, the rain is pouring, the thunder's rolling, and the lightning is flashing. As you stand there powerless and small, I want you to audibly say out loud and command that storm to cease and see what happens. This summer there's going to be a day where it's 100 degrees outside and 100% humidity. And on that day, I want you to walk outside and I want you to go in the middle of the day when it's blistering hot, and I want you to look up at the sun with your eyes squinted, and I want you to tell it to stop shining and see what happens. On a clear summer night, which we're soon to have in the very near future, Lord willing, I want you to go outside in your backyard, and because we don't live in a place where any skyline is blocking the view, you can look up on a cloudless night and see stars that you can't even count them all. Go out in your backyard and lay in the grass and look up at the sky and audibly tell all those stars to fall from the sky and see what happens. How much success will you have, church, in doing this? None. Why? You know that your words can't stop waves from crashing, can't stop the tide from coming or going, can't make storms cease or the sun stop shining or stars fall from heaven. I think we all know the answer to that. You are powerless over the laws of nature in this universe, but Christ has all power over it all. Christians, you need to be reminded this morning that we do not serve a weak, powerless, and tired God. We serve a God that has ultimate power in all situations. And even the wind, the sea, the suns, and the stars, they must all obey Him at His very word. Mark chapter 4 shows us a story of Jesus and the disciples getting into a boat. Jesus has been teaching. He's been healing. It had been a long day, and as He had taught the people, He told the disciples, hey, we need to get in a boat and go to the other side. And as they crossed the Sea of Galilee, a violent storm arises. Kind of know how the story ends. Jesus calms it. But why are these men so afraid of this storm? No doubt these men had been in a severe thunderstorm before, which is what I simply entitled today's message, a severe thunderstorm warning. These men had been there before. So why are they so afraid? Let me show you something. I'm going to give you a couple pictures on the screen. Greg, throw me one of them up. I don't care which one. You see this? There's a picture of the Sea of Galilee. If you look on the far eastern side, you can see a mountain range there. If you look on this western side, you can see high mountains as well. There's very few spots where there's valley for you to enter. It's almost surrounded by mountainous hills all the way around. Now show me the other one, Greg, if you can bring it. You can see here one of the areas where there's valley, but on the far eastern side, it's completely encompassed by mountains. Actually, just about 30 miles down the road is Mount Hermon, which is 9,200 feet above sea level, and the Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. So what that means is when the heat of the water and the humidity rises from the Sea of Galilee and the cold air from the mountain comes down, when they collide, they can cause very quick, very unexpected, very violent storms. These disciples had no doubt encountered these storms before. So why is this one so different from all the rest? If they had been in these storms, they know the Sea of Galilee brings up violent white squalls. Why is it that this one has them so afraid? We all have to admit that there are times in our lives, just like these disciples, where the violent nature of nature can make our faith a little bit wobbly. If that's you, well, guess what? You're in good company this morning because the disciples were there as well. Now, they were no doubt in a physical, actual storm, but many of us may be going through some storms in our own lives this morning. Sometimes it's very hard to make sense of storms. Truth is, we look out and say, why did a storm come through here and not here? Why did that hurricane hit this coast and not that coast? Why were those people impacted and not these people? Why does he go through a storm and not him? We can't always make sense of them. The storms of life can sometimes feel that very way. And matter of fact, church, some of you today sitting in these pews saying, why me, God? Why am I going through this? When it seems everybody else has got it all together. Can I summarize it and put us all in the same boat? Everybody going through stuff. Everybody. Yours may not be public, and you may have hid it real well from the general public, but we all going through stuff, and we all going through it right now. As Christians, we'll endure storms while we're on this faith journey. And sometimes those storms will be violent. Sometimes they'll be hard to understand. But other times it'll be nothing more than a drizzle that just kind of annoys us. But no doubt, we're going to go through them. I've heard it put this way before, and I'm sure you have as well. I hear people say often that as Christians, we're in one of three spots. We're either coming in a storm, we're in a storm, or we're coming out of a storm. Have you ever heard that before? We're either in a storm, or coming into one, or we're in it, or we're about to come out of it. You know what I have discovered in my life? That point 2 of being in the storm seems to last a lot longer than the coming in and the going out. Y'all with me on this? Hear me loud and clear this morning, church. Following Christ will sometimes result in some tough storms. But we must live our lives in such a manner that we're not the cause of storms for others. Did y'all hear what I just said? We need to live in such a way that we can hold people accountable, that we can call out sin where sin needs to be called out, that we can have tough conversations when they needed to be had, but we're not doing it to maliciously stir up trouble where there is no trouble to be stirred. Essentially, if a storm is going to arise, let us live in such a manner that we help each other through it instead of being the reason somebody goes through it. There's one thing I want to remind you this morning as we get to the text. One thing I want you to see very clear is that on your faith journey with Christ, you will not go through any storms alone. That's where you say amen. No matter how much you panic, no matter how much you fear, no matter how much you cry, no matter how much you feel all alone or just even flat out confused, the truth of the gospel is that no Christian walks through storms alone. Even if your spouse leaves, even if your children move far away, even if your friends are nowhere to be found, if your company gives you a pink slip, you're not walking through any of these valleys alone as a Christian. The promise of God and the truth of the gospel remains regardless of the storm, and hear me on this, church, regardless of how you feel. Your feelings will lie to you. Your feelings will lead you astray, but the truth of the gospel remains. Can I give you an illustration? You guys know I've shared with you this time last year as I had the little issue with my hip that we didn't know what was going on. You guys probably remember me telling you about that. Well, when they discovered that, that I had this weird condition called cystic angiomatosis, that it was in my hip, well, it looks like just little tumors. Well, the one that was in my hip, the one they were going to have to fix, it was causing me so much pain. The doctor said, you need to get an MRI. I said, okay. Well, my mom died of cancer. She had 1 million MRIs. I've heard you guys talk about, I got to go get an MRI on my shoulder. I got to get an MRI on this. Bev even had to have an MRI one time. She just said, hey, I went to get an MRI today, blah, blah, blah. I've never given it any thought. But I gave it thought the day they put me in there. And you can strip me of my man card if you want to. I do not care. But when they took me in that room and they laid me on that little table and they put me in this straw, they squeezed me in a straw. And I got in there and realized I can't move. And my shoulders are up against this thing and it's like right here on my face. And I realized I am completely out of control here. I can't control anything that's happening. And the lady says to me, we're going to give you this little button. You can hold it right here. Y'all been through this before, right? Well, this was all new to me. She gave me this little button. She said, hey, if you get in there, if you get scared or you need some relief, whatever, hit that button, we'll pull you back out. And I said, but you're going to put me back in, right? She said, yeah. I said, we're not pushing that button because when we go in, we're not coming back out and going back in. We're going in, we're getting this over with, and we're coming back out. And she figured out real quick, I didn't like this. I didn't know I was this claustrophobic. I didn't know until I started going in there. And the nurse figured it out real quick. Here's what she did. As I'm going in the little tube, the nurse is right there. And she leans over as I'm going in and she says, Jeremy, I'm going to be right here the whole time. And there's another nurse right around this wall right here looking at the screen. I'm right here the whole time. I won't leave you. Strip me of my man card. I do not care. It gave me a sense of peace of knowing I'm not here alone. Had she walked away and left me in that room alone, beep, 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 you got to get me out of here. I ain't doing this. It gave me some sense of a calm that I can't explain to know I'm not going through this alone. Literally, there's someone right here with me, and if that ain't enough, there's another one back there with me. I'm not in here alone. Look at me, Christians. You don't go through the storms of life alone. God's right there with you. When you're going through the darkest, deepest tunnel, the darkest, deepest valley, the darkest, deepest time of your life, and you're like, I can't go in this, God. I can't do it alone. He's right there saying, you ain't going alone. I'm right here. I ain't going to leave you. I ain't going to leave you. The storms of life may be raging, church, but the power of God is not fading. John MacArthur said the entire point of this text that I read to you this morning, he said the entire point of this scenario is that Jesus wants to teach His disciples that He can be trusted even in the most threatening of circumstances. The storms of life may be raging, church, but the power of Christ is not fading. These storms would have been no surprise to the disciples. They've been there before. But why are they so afraid this time, church? I think the answer to that question is multifaceted, but if I had to narrow it down to you for one simple point this morning, it's this. The disciples were scared because they failed to recognize who was in the boat with them. They've been in this boat before, but they've been there with their other fishing buddies. They've been in this boat before with other disciples. James and John been in it before together. Peter and Andrew been in it together. And when the storm arose this time and the water began to get in the boat and the waves crashed over the side and they thought they were going to die, why were they so afraid this time but not any other time? Because they failed to recognize who was in it with them. Do you know why most of our storms are so frightening to us, so terrifying to us, so scary to us? Is because we fail to recognize who's going through them with us. We fail to recognize that the God of this universe is walking through it with us. That God Almighty has not left us. That when we feel like we in that MRI tube all by ourselves, God is right there saying, I'm not going to leave you. The story this morning shows us a bunch of things. It shows us three things in regards to the storms. It shows us that they were unpredictable. It shows us they're unavoidable and that they're uncontrollable. The same is true for us as Christians. Many of the storms that come our way are unpredictable. We don't plan these things. I know you all well enough to know that as you're planning out your week, I don't think any of you are going, Monday's going to be a good day. Tuesday, when I get home from work, I'm going to come home and I hope everything falls apart. Then Wednesday, we're going to go back to having a good day. I mean, nobody plans that, right? But sometimes they're unpredictable. But they're also unavoidable. Jesus said, we go into the other side. And the only way for them to get to the other side was to go through the storm. Now, this is a whole nother sermon for a whole nother day, but I want to show you the heaven perspective of this. As Christians, we go into the other side. Did y'all hear me? We're going to the other side. And to get there, sometimes we got to go through some storms. But we will go through those storms with Christ with us. The text also shows us three things about Jesus. Not only does it show us that the storms were unpredictable, unavoidable, and uncontrollable, but it shows us that Jesus has power over the storm. It shows us that His presence with us through the storm. And it shows us the peace that He gives us in the storm. The text also shows us a lesson in theology that Jesus Christ was fully God and fully man. You're thinking, how's that true, Pastor? Because He was fully God because He needed rest and He was asleep. But he was fully man because he was asleep, and fully God because he spoke and nature stopped. This text also mirrors the Old Testament story of Jonah. Y'all know the story of Jonah, the prophet Jonah? You know what he went through? You know about the boat and the ship? This story is the exact same, almost identical story. Watch. Jonah got in a boat. Jesus and the disciples got in a boat. Jonah's boat was overtaken by a storm. This boat almost overtaken by a storm. Jonah was asleep in the boat. Jesus asleep in the boat. In both accounts, the other sailors thought they were going to die. Jonah's situation needed God to intervene. The disciples' situation needed Christ to intervene. Both groups knew they were more terrified after the storm. If you read Jonah's story, guess what happens? When the storm ceases, the sailors say, oh my goodness, this God is more powerful than we can even imagine, and they were even more afraid. In this story, it says here at the end of that text, that they were even more afraid when it was done. But here's the reason I mentioned Jonah's situation similar to this one. Watch, church. In both narratives, Jonah and the disciples entered a storm. In both narratives, Jonah and the disciples had specific instructions from God. In one narrative, the storm came on the disobedience of Jonah. In the other scenario, the storm came on the obedience of the disciples. Now, this is interesting, church, because we see a man running from God entering a storm and people going with God entering a storm. What do we make of that? Well, it's very simple, that God sends rain on the just and the unjust, that the righteous and the unrighteous go through storms, that we all battle storms, that nobody is exempt from going through the struggles of this world. Sometimes people find themselves in a royal mess, in a royal storm of their life, and sometimes that storm is because we made mistakes in not following God. Other times those storms come because we're following God. That is a unique place to be, church. When you know, if I follow God, He's going with me through some storms. If I run from God, that may be the very storm I go into. So both Jonah and the disciples knew what it was like to be in a storm. But there's one huge difference. I want you to watch this. The disciples went through the storm with God. Jonah went through the storm running from God. If we have to go through storms, let's do so with Christ, not running from Christ. In this text, we see the storms of life may be raging, but the power of Christ is not fading. Sometimes it's like a storm sent to us from God. Sometimes a storm is sent to us from God for this very purpose, to get our attention. Can we be honest this morning? Can you be honest with me? We are all guilty of what I'm about to say. Every one of us in this room are guilty of forgetting God when times are good and running to Him in a panic when times are bad. Let us know that the storms we're going through them with Christ. He hadn't left us. He hadn't left us. But let us not forget Him when we exit the storm and the sun is shining. Sometimes it takes a storm from God to remind us of our need for Him. Truth is, sometimes some of you in this room, you're just like me, you forget God. Sometimes you like to be in control. Any control freaks in this room? You like to have control of everything, right? I know some of those. I got a few of them in my family. I saw a documentary this week that kind of drove this point home. It's like a little 30-minute show on TV. And it was a documentary on self-driving cars. And the documentary happened as they were traveling down the interstate with no one driving the car, the guy in the back seat with the interviewer in the back seat with him, interviewing him, talking about the power of the automated car with no one driving it while it's going down the interstate. I'm out, church. I want to drive. I don't know about that. That's a little unnerving to me. I don't know if it is for you, but there's something about that that says, I'd like to be in control of that car. There's something that says, something a little unnerving about this. If I'm going down I-85, for whatever reason, I look beside me and there ain't nobody driving, We might have some issues here. I'm letting that car go on past me. Get out of my way. But as Christians, you know what, church? Many of us do this very same thing. In that we are supposed to let go. Let God have control. And how many times do we say, nah, God, you scoot over. I got this one. Nah. As Christians, we have to make sure that we let God do what only God can do. Jesus tells us 3 things in this text. I want to show them to you this morning. Look at the first words of Jesus in verse 35. On the same day when evening had come, he said to them, let us cross over to the other side. Literally, they needed to go in a different direction. Jesus needed his space and his time, and he needed to get away from the crowd. But he asked the disciples to get in the boat with him, and let's go over to the other side. Jesus put them in this storm. Don't miss this point, church. Jesus put them there. So a lot of times we do everything in our power to plead and beg God to remove the storm, stop the storm, help us to avoid the storm. Lord, show us where the storm is coming so I can drive in a different direction. In this text, Jesus said, y'all come with me. We going into a storm. That don't sound like something I want to sign up for. But the truth is that Jesus never left them in the storm, and he had power over it. So he told them, let's go to the other side. But then in verse 39, look what he said to them. When the storm was raging, he said, peace, be still. It's ironic to me that the very thing Jesus said to nature is the very thing he desires from us. To have his peace and be still. And know that God can do what only God can do. Not only did he give the instructions to the disciples to go to the other side, not only did he say, peace, be still, but then he asked 2 questions to the disciples. Look at the end in verse 40. He asked them 2 questions. Question number 1, he said, what are you so afraid of? I could ask you that as a congregation today. What are we so afraid of? And then the second question he asked them is, why do you still have no faith? Jesus literally saying, how many more things I got to do here for you to realize and have faith? I've already healed the paralytic. I've already healed the man with the withered hand. I've already done all these things. I don't know how much more you want to see me do before you would have faith. You've heard me teach. You've saw me call. You've saw me change. You've saw me heal. You've saw me forgive. And now we're in a storm and you think this is the one thing that I can't do. How many times do we do this, church? We always think the next hurdle is the one God's not going to get us over, right? We always think that. God, I look back over my life and realize you have brought me all the way to this point and you hadn't let me down yet, but this is the one hurdle, God, you can't fix. Got to kick that hurdle down 2 seconds. Walk you right through it. The instructions to the disciples, the instruction in nature, but then they asked 2 questions. There are so many other truths in this text that one sermon can't possibly cover them all. Just to name a few, there's the truth that Jesus is more powerful than the storm. There's the truth that nature must obey the very words of Christ. There's the truth of oftentimes our fear being greater than our faith. There's the power of God that can leave people even with questions. There's peace that comes when Jesus arose. Not to go on a totally separate sermon for you this morning, but I want you to see the very words that are used in this passage are the very words used at the resurrection. Meaning that when they looked at Jesus asleep in the boat, it was as if they had said, hey, he's dead. And Jesus arose to give them the peace. Same words that are used in the resurrection when Jesus was dead and he arose to give us victory. The list could go on and on. But no matter, church, this morning how violent, no matter how dark, no matter how overwhelming, no matter how scary, how difficult, how painful, how powerful, how tearful, or how dreadful the storm may be, Christ does not let those who belong to him go through them alone. It's one of the greatest and most often missed promises of God that he will not let us go through anything alone. Matthew 28 says, and lo, I am with you always, even till the end of the age. I asked the 9 o'clock service this morning, why do we even pray for God to be with us when he already promised he won't leave? It's a wasted prayer. It'd be no different than when a professor asks the students in his class to sit at their desks and they're already sitting there. Why would he do that? It makes no sense. It'd be the equivalent of me telling you, hey, church, sit in your pews right now. Sit in your pews. You go, okay, preacher, we are. It'd be a wasted statement, right? It's a wasted prayer to ask God to be with you when He's already promised He ain't going to leave. If He ain't going to leave, you ain't got to ask Him to be there. He's already there. I mean, it'd be like me sitting in that MRI machine begging that nurse to say, would you stay with me? Stay, please stay. Stay, don't leave. Stay. She's like, I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Same is true with God. In this story, the disciples, though, they had legitimate reason to be scared. This is, for all practical purposes, they feel like they're in a Category 5 storm. They feel like they're in an F5 tornado. They feel like the Richter scale has just been broken by this earthquake, by this storm that they are in. They feel like it's overwhelming. But I want to remind you this morning that Jesus won't leave you in your storm. I don't care what storm you're going through, whether it's an actual storm or whether it's a personal storm, an employment storm, a relationship storm. I don't care what it is, Christ will not leave you in it. Matter of fact, last year when we were walking through some of the promises of God, I made this statement to you that I injected again today because it's worth saying. I want to remind you that Jesus will not leave you. Although He left everything else, He won't leave you. I want you to think about it with me, church. He left His heavenly Father to come to His earthly Father. He left His heavenly throne to come to His earthly throne. He left the manger for the cross. He left the cross for the tomb. He left the tomb to go back to His disciples. He left His disciples to ascend back to the Father. But He won't leave you. But He won't leave you. Church family, let us cling to that promise today. That when everything seems to be falling apart, it seems as if nobody cares. It seems as if there's no answer anywhere. Let us cling to this promise that God will not leave us. Look in the middle of the text with me, if you will, at verse 37. Verse 37 says, a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, and so that it was already filling. This storm was legitimately intense, church. This wasn't just a rain shower. This was an intense storm, and the boat was getting close to sinking. Can we cut the disciples some slack? Because if you was in this same boat, you would be acting just like they acting. You'd have a bucket throwing the water out, right? You'd be acting just like they acting. Does anybody care? God, do you even care? But watch what happens in verse 38. But he was in the stern asleep on a pillow. Did you catch this? The worst storm they ever been in their life. The worst storm they've ever seen. And God is asleep. Jesus in the boat, sound asleep. It's one of the truths of Scripture is that it's filled with almost irrelevant details. It's one of the ways that you know oftentimes when people are telling you the truth. They have memory of irrelevant details. Why does it even matter that it tells us that he was asleep on a cushion, on a pillow? Literally, disciples are looking around saying, this storm is so violent. How in the world can you possibly just have your head laid on a pillow like nothing's wrong? But that's not how this reads, church. Let me read it to you once more. Look at verse 38. Look with me, if you will, in verse 38. Throw it on the screen as well. But he was in the stern asleep on a pillow. And they woke him up, saying to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? That's not how it went down, church. It's not at all how it went down. They did not go over to him and go, Sir, the boat's filling up with water. Sir, wake up. Nah. I mean, do you understand what they just did here? They pleaded with him. They pleaded, hey, Jesus, do you even care? Hey, you going to wake up? We dying here. The boat's going to break. It's filling up with water. We dying. Jesus, do you care? Do you even care? Many of you right now asking God the same question. God, do you even care? Some of you asking him that. Some of you asking that to your friends and to the people around you. Does anybody even care about me? And the answer is emphatically yes. There is one that cares, limitlessly cares. He cares deeply for every situation you're going through. No matter the storm, he's not going to let you walk through it alone. A few years back, there was a billboard in Oklahoma that had these words written on the billboard. All it said was, Jesus does not care. And then at the bottom of the billboard, there was a little website. It said, JesusDoesNotCare.com. There's a lot of flack for that billboard. People's like, that's not true. Jesus does care. Why would a church or an organization post such a billboard that says Jesus does not care when we know He does care? Well, the whole point was hopefully people would go to this website, and when they got there, they found out that it said, Jesus does not care who you are, He can still save you. Jesus does not care what you've done, He can still forgive you. Jesus does not care where you've been, He will still go with you. The whole point was to get people to go to the website, but it came across as if to say Jesus does not care. Many of you in this very room today are looking at your situation and you're going, I don't think God cares. Let me remind you, sometimes the only thing you will have to hang on to in this world is the fact that I am going through a storm with Jesus. Just because the storm is raging doesn't mean that God is absent. Just because the storm is powerful doesn't mean that God is weak. Just because the storm is more than you can bear, it doesn't mean that God does not care. So here's your severe thunderstorm warning today, as I told you at the beginning. Your warning is this, that storms will come. Storms will often be tough. But the storms are not greater, they are not stronger, they are not bigger, and they are not more powerful than the words of Christ. This text is not about just getting you through the storms of life, but this text is about showing you who Christ is, who He is, that He is the God of the universe. His very words stop storms and cease raging seas. Literally makes the water eddy. But it also shows us where He is, that He goes with us through Him. And third, it shows us what He can do. And the answer to that is anything. Hope you want to come this morning. As Hope comes to sing, I want to remind you that while the storms of life may be raging, the power of Christ is not fading. You, this morning, may very well be going through a storm. And I want to remind you of this truth. I don't know what the storm is, and I don't know what God's answer for it on the other side is, but I know this. Whatever storm you're going through, you're not going through it alone. Let me pray. Lord, as Hope sings this morning, I pray that we will be reminded that when severe thunderstorms come in our lives, that we can cling to the truth that we won't go through them alone. In Jesus' name.